Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jim Ryan. I'm the Associate Director for the Kevorkian Center of Near Eastern Studies at NYU, and I'm really thrilled to be with you here today for our first event of the spring semester. This is a special event. We are here to celebrate books by two of our close friends of the program, if you will, Gil Hochberg and Shirley Bahar. And we're gonna, this is a special kind of event in which we're gonna have a conversation about, Palestine, Israel, visual culture, and the neatly and lovely overlapping of these two new publications. I'm gonna keep things pretty brief here off the top. I just wanna mention our thanks to the Center for Media, Culture, and History here at NYU. Faye Ginsberg is with us, I think, representing their center, and we want to extend a warm and hearty thanks to her. They've been a great partner through the years and have worked with us on this to put this event together. And so a quick word also on the format for today's event. We are going to, after my very brief introduction, hand things over to Shirley, who's going to share for about 10 minutes, the core arguments of her book, and she's got some fantastic images to share with us. We'll then turn things over to Gil, who is going to do the same, and we are very lucky to have with us our colleague from the Media, Culture, and Communications Department, Helga Tawil-Suri, to act as moderator for the event. She will then, after the initial presentations, provide some thoughts and some comments and questions, and we'll have a conversation for about 45 minutes or so from there between our three panelists today. After about an hour or so of the event, we will open things up to public question and answer portion. For that session, part of the session, we do encourage you all to submit questions by the chat at any time. You can submit them just in the regular chat bar, or if you prefer to ask a question anonymously, you may do so by sending me a direct message, and I'll make sure that it gets relayed to Helga in an anonymous manner. And if you prefer, once we open things up to ask your questions verbally, you'll be able to raise your hand and we'll ask you to unmute and ask your question that way. So very briefly, to start things off, the title of our event today is Palestine, Israel, Visual Culture, and the World to Come, and is featuring a conversation between Shirley Bahar, who is a graduate of NYU's Media, Culture, and Communications PhD program. She now teaches at Columbia's School of the Visual Arts. And we'll post a fuller bio in the chat as soon as I move things over. And then we're also very, very excited to be here to talk with her about her book, Documentary Cinema in Israel-Palestine: Performance, the Body, and the Home, which has just been published by Bloomsbury. You'll see in a moment in the chat a link to where you can purchase her book along with a discount code that we can offer for you all today. And then also we are thrilled and honored to have with us Gil Hochberg, who is the Ransford Professor of Hebrew and Visual Studies, Comparative Literature and Middle East Studies at Columbia. And we are here to talk with her about her brand new book, Becoming Palestine: Towards an Archival Imagination of the Future. And that is out very, very recently with Duke University Press, and we'll also be including, along with her bio in a bit, a link where you can purchase that book as well with a discount code. All right, so time for me to get out of the way and hand things over to Shirley. Sorry, hold on, I'll have to find her here. And please take it away. There you are. Hi, Shirley. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to turn things over to you. And all right, thank you all for being here.
Thank you all. Welcome. Yeah, thank you, Kevorkian team. Thank you, Center for Media and Religion, Faye, Peggy, Jim, Fidele. And yeah, I'm going to start with a note of thank you. I'm really, really, really honored to share space with several of my mentors today, with Helga, with Gil, with Ella, who's also here, with many more of you that have been a big part of this this project, this little baby, and of course my parents, who I think should be here too, for whom this book is dedicated to. Yeah, writing is hard, Scoop. It's just sometimes and preciously joyful, but I really, really believe in all of these writing hurdles. No one writes alone. I definitely did not. I owe a big thanks to many of you. And yeah, thank you, Gil and Helga, for always being not just mentors and advisors, but also sincere and caring interlocutors. And of course to you, Ella, who supervised me in this journey. So yeah, writing. Writing is also something that occurs multi-temporally. Yeah, if we consider the timeline of research, publication, and of course, all of our like personal, neuro, mental, emotional, multisensorial round trips in and out of clarity. Yeah, so I want to just, say something about this. This multi-temporal component. There's the rapidly changing political moment, right? That happens as we go, as we're in the writing and until, until graduation and until publication. Documentary cinema in Israel, Palestine, performance, the body, the home, is primarily, I would say, for today, anchored around three watershed moments that shifted how we view and talk about Palestine. First of all, this is the moment, the present moment that we're all in, the moment of the reception of the book that just came out in July. For me, this present moment in the making is a time of collective deep reflection on how representations and discourse of Palestine are in flux, and especially since May of 2021. Then there was the year 2014 that we all remember, and that's the year when I wrote much of this book, first as a dissertation. Non-coincidentally, that moment of heightened awareness, that was a moment of heightened awareness to how movements interrelate and show solidarity globally. And it's been really inspiring my writing ever since. In my book, I characterized the way of documentaries by and about Palestinians and Mizrahim mostly living inside 48 Palestine, Israel, that came out during the first decade of the 2000s. My book explores tropes of relationalities, it's not a coincidence, in the representation of oppression and pain of Palestinians and Mizrahim, whose realities in 48 and beyond are interconnected political personal realities. The year 2014 and the present moment are very much on my mind as I take us back to the groundbreaking moment of 2002 when these documentaries started coming out, or that's the moment when I start writing from. And now I'm gonna share my screen. Share screen. Yes. This is me discovering that I'm in a documentary for a split second, which I did not know. So on the left, yeah. So as I was saying, the writing of this book took place against the backdrop of the growing intersectional and global interconnectedness of movements that coordinate their struggles, have been coordinating their struggles against oppression and state violence. In the stretch of time between 2014 and now, I have been carried by hopeful pulls tightening the theoretical understandings and human bonds between those who are leading struggles for liberation around the world. One such major pull emanated from the uprisings in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, and the official founding of the Black Lives Matter movement. The messages of support and encouragement pouring from Palestine to Ferguson and back brought about a reinvigorated examination of the historical ties between US-based and global Black and Palestinian-led movements and anti-colonial and anti-racist movements at large. If we think about Nora Erekat and Mark Lamont Hill here doing a lot of this theorization, for example. I wrote this book as a Mizrahi Turkish-Israeli scholar, and it was driven, very personal book, of course, very personal writing. It was driven by my wish to enhance Mizrahi, specifically Mizrahi solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for liberation and return. In 2014, I also flew to Istanbul to spend my first summer there, full summer there since I was a child. That access that I have always had to Turkey, right, we're passport holders, means the world to me. I have, yeah, it's a window to my family's 500-year histories there. That summer, that access that I have to the Turkish language also facilitated my daily encounter with numerous visceral, very hyper-visualized reports from Gaza that summer in the Turkish media, reports that very much humanized, centered and humanized Palestinian pain in ways that I didn't otherwise see in the US and inside 48. And that's, I think, also changing. What I found out slowly and later crafted into my argument is that reconnecting to my home of Istanbul when sensing excessive rage, agony, and empathy regarding you know, what Susan Sontag called famously the pain of others in occupied Jerusalem, in besieged, bombarded Gaza, will not amount to politicization single-handedly. Rather, it takes perpetual learning and unlearning and visual and sensorial training in reading cultural texts. It takes endless emotional and ethical labor. And that's what the book is about, to try and relate to the pain of others in a deeply personal and politically committed manner. Let's go back to a moment in 2002, the moment of the release of Muhammad Bakri's Jenin Jenin. My greatest wish is to go back home, a young girl says in Muhammad Bakri's Jenin Jenin, and smiles for the first time. After we have seen her walking through the rubble that used to be her home in the Jenin refugee camp, she summarizes her vision of a return to Palestine in this way. And when asked to pick his favorite scene from any film, renowned Kurdish Iranian Israeli actor and activist Yosef Shiloach chose that scene exactly with the young girl from Jenin Jenin. And said in explanation, I identify with the Palestinian people. It's simple, so simple. Mizrahi thinkers, artists, and organizers like Shiloach, and like the filmmakers and subjects of the analyzed documentaries, have been for years nurturing an unapologetically Mizrahi opposition to Zionism in Israel and solidarity with Palestinians. Marginalized, but definitely existent. They taught us that our pain as Mizrahi immigrants is real and nonetheless inextricably intertwined with the pain of Palestinians. But what might it feel like for a Mizrahi viewer or reader to take in and live with the hopeful eyes, fervent longings and political demand of the girl from Jenin Jenin to return home? And that's really an impetus, a really leading question for me. when reading about or watching, and if we let it, also feeling the pain of another person that has been living on through ongoing effects of an oppression that we ourselves did not, or perhaps we did, but experienced or expressing it differently, what kind of emotional and ethical labor may the feeling harbor? And that has everything to do with viewership. Yeah, good, all good? Yeah, okay. Watching the documentaries I analyzed, we can begin practicing viscerally engaging in intersubjective accountability. That's a big argument that I make. Above all, the political, cinematic, and performative trends that the documentaries share is their invitation to understand pain as relational. As interactive sites of testimony, the documentary performances powerfully politicize pain by shaping it as a relational event that took place between the performing person and the state and is lingering, speaking of temporalities and the archive, lingering in the person's body, is archived in the person's body and ways of speaking, of expressing themselves and representing themselves till the day that they're standing in front of the camera. The documentary performances are multi-layered encounters, relational, between bodies, affective, mental and neuromental states, speeches, and filmic apparatuses, and the filmmaker, in which the film's participants return to the past, formative, painful experiences that they still embody and endure and resist. The hit of the bullet, the demolished home, the lost carob. Maybe I'll just go to the lost carob. Yeah, 500 Dunam on the Moon, Rachel Leah Jones. The lost carob tree, the dried fountain, the unattainable moon, the imposed mask, the interior of the home, the fence of the camp are all imagery communicating particular ways of living, hurting, being in, resisting, and becoming through political conditions of oppression and pain. Sharing their told film performances, the participants invite us to feel the trajectories of an oppression that became an archive of pain with them, take that journey with them and relate to their experiences of living on through pain. So yeah, my last sentence here, and I hope to show more images as we continue the discussion, is really the documentary cinema in Israel, Palestine is an invitation to us all as viewers, really hopes to be of interest for anyone who wishes to understand their own feelings of powerlessness, right? Sometimes we feel powerlessness as not one with them privately and naturally, but rather as public, as political, as relatable, and as changeable. Thank you for now.
All right, and I will get Gil in the spotlight. There we go. All right, thank you so much, Shirley, and take it away, Gil.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Shirley, for your presentation. And it's very moving to see a text that you've seen as a dissertation become into a manuscript, a book. It's really a rewarding experience. I also want to thank everybody from the Kevorkian Center, as Shirley did. I want to especially thank Helga for giving us her limited and cherished time. And you know, in a way, Helga had the most amount of work for this because she had to read and think comparatively about the two projects. So I really want to thank you. I also want to thank all the people who are here today in the audience. I will try to keep my comments relatively brief. I think for one thing, because we are discussing the two books together, it is very interesting to, maybe we'll do that more later, but to think about, the relationship between the books. And one of the things that I thought about talking about my book in this context was that there are clearly some very strong shared impetus of ethical and political commitment. Interestingly, I think it is productive to think about the different ways in which I think the two books operate in this way. Different, of course, doesn't mean one better than the other, simply a different mode of operation. So Becoming Palestine, for me, is the book is mostly an attempt to rethink the role of archive and archives in the particular context of Israel and Palestine. But in this sense, it is important for me to emphasize that it is not a book about archives as much as it is a book about how art can activate archives. And one thing that I think is very prominent in both our projects is the place that we both give to art and to artistic endeavors as a sort of modality of rethinking the present and the political present. For me, what this means is that the way I see it is that in the context of Palestine, historians, and not only in that context, but in this context in particular, historians have had a monopoly over the archive. And that means that both historians and archaeologists use archives to, quote unquote, dig the past and present us with the facts of history. Whether those facts are go all the way back to biblical narratives or their more recent past of documenting the actual atrocities of 1948 in the Nakba. In both cases, the impetus is about digging, revealing, so to speak, past traces and informing us about what has happened in the past as a constitutive of how we should understand the present. In this particular book, I talk about the concept of archival fatigue in the context of Palestine, and I call specifically to moving away from a kind of history with capital H emphasis on the archive as a source for factual information, and rather engaging in a recreation of archives, mostly through the activization of the archive through art as a way of finding traces of the future in the present. So it's a very future-oriented project. And in that sense, that is also what has dictated my selection of artistic works that I see as having, these are primarily Palestinian artists, either filmmakers, dancers, choreographers, writers, all modes of artistic creation that I believe activates the archive, either particular archives, actual archives, or concepts of archives in order to open a future or a potential future as a mode of political becoming and political potentiality. I want to just mention what I mean by the title and the concept of becoming Palestine. I use the term to invoke Gilles Deleuze's distinction that is very prominent in my own work between political poetic intervention on the one hand and historical investigation on the other hand. For Deleuze, and I follow his lead on this, I quote, "Art has the potential to resist the teleology of history by opening imagination to the yet to come future. Art is where the present becomes less immediately recognizable. It is less something we already know," end quote. So in some ways, really my attempt to engage with the various artistic works that I read in this book is about opening the borders of the possible. And while this all might seem like an academic exercise, I insist in the book that it really is far from it. It's actually a very urgent political matter, not just for me as a reader of these works or somebody who has curated the togetherness of these works, but I think in the works themselves, there is a call to reconsider what it means to think seriously about politics and ethics. And I think that the call in these works, and I will at the very end ask Shirley to kindly share some images so you can at least have some tangible sense of some of the works I'm talking about, but that these works are really about the incentive of reassuring the place of imagination as an important cognitive and ethical and psychological means of doing politics. What I mean by this is that as much as we receive much from facts and from documentation of facts and historical data, what this book strives for is to suggest that the right to have rights, which is, of course, Hannah Arendt's famous articulation, is an important right and a substantial one, but it is not a sufficient one. And that the right to imagine is the only full articulation of a political and ethical being. And so the book itself does engage with these different arts, photography, conceptual art, all of which have an attempt in my mind or my reading to open a world to a political imagination and suggest that the role of the of these artists is to facilitate our ability to imagination, and that our political intervention begins with the ability or commitment to imagine otherwise. In this sense, I really am informed by the art. I consider all the artists that I talk about to be my, not just my archive, so to speak, but the works through which I think together. So I will mention a few of the names, and then maybe we can just look at some of the images. I don't think that in this context I can really do justice of talking about each of the works, because none of these works are sort of straightforward in the sense that they're very conceptual works. They're essay films, they're dance, or they are citational in other ways, and I'll say a word about that. So I'd rather just show some of the images and intrigue you by that to actually look up the artists. Each of them has a website. We're all in the 21st century, and so I would just recommend looking directly at the work. So I will mention the artists I pay very close attention to: Jomana Mana, Basel Abbas, Ruwan Abu Rahim, Omar El Garbi, Shuruk Harb, Kamal Al Jafari, Larissa Sansour, Farah Saleh, and Basma El Sharif. And there are others, but these are ones that the chapters look very closely at. Two last points before we go to the images that I want to mention is that my sort of engagement with this archive, one can call it an alternative archive, a kind of activization of an archive that isn't an archive of Palestine, but is an archive of becoming Palestine. And perhaps we can talk about that more in the Q&A. Is that I do have an insistent sort of running argument that perhaps runs side by side with Shirley, or actually is very different. I don't know, it's something that we can discuss, which is that there is on my end, and I believe on the end of the artists, a resistance to the pull of the archive to a narrative of identity, in the sense that the way I think about these works and the archive is less so from a beginning point of a we or a recognizable us, and more of a way of rethinking the present as an archive of the future, in the deepest sense that the present is an opportunity to find traces of a future we or us that is still to become. And of course, that we or us or I cannot already have an explicit or clear name. It can have traces of names, and it is built in terms of, textually speaking, in terms of citations, but it is a different, I suppose, starting point, in the sense that it is an archive of becoming is necessarily an archive of a social reality that isn't yet there. So I think I'll end here, and just because I am so techno unsavvy, I've asked Shirley if she could share the screen for me, because
Actually, Gil, I've got it ready to go here.
oh, okay, because I personally didn't know how to figure this out. But so I cannot comment right now, but I just want you to, I'll just say maybe, a word that in this is a short film, which Mana is tracing an archive of a German Jewish ethnomusicologist, and recreating a film about music in pre-1948 Palestine, which is in dialogue with Robert Lachman, who is in this photograph. And so it's just an example of an archive that Mana herself is creating by her own recording, that is in a dialogue with a much earlier archive, and is in that sense also works on it, changes it, critical of it, but engages it. A very, very multi-layered and wonderful film. We can move. A very different project. This is Larissa Sansur, In the Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain. It's a short, or it's a close to 30 minutes, but a sci-fi film. And as you can see already from just for this image, the fascinating layers of visual citations from the refugee camp tents to the Palestinian traditional garment, to the biblical sort of anachronism, to the narrator, who is called the narrator slash terrorist, who is centered in the middle. And I read this as a critique of archaeology, and specifically kind of a cheek and tongue attempt to read Zionism as science fiction. We can move, and we'll skip to, this is also from that film. Okay, so this a very complex, layered work, and yet my mask is powerful, by Abu Rahim and Abbas, and it's so many stages to this work. It's a work that started with the artist actually taking youth to Palestinian villages within the 1948 borders, re-identifying some of the areas, and then collecting both vegetation and ruins and notes from there, recreating an archive of the present, literally an organic archive, which later had even further development. I think we can skip to one more. No, it must have been before that. Yes, so if you see here, this is a later stage of the exhibition, which also followed later on by a book and a performance. But where you see these masks that are actually 3D copy masks that the artist created of Neolithic masks that were initially introduced in the Museum of Archaeology in Israel, in Jerusalem. Not only did the artist recreate the copy, as they call it, the copy of the original archaeological masks, they further generated quote unquote fake news about a dangerous youth movement of Palestinians who are running around with these mysterious masks into villages. And actually that news has become news in Israeli media. And so the sort of chain of events of copy and real and fake news and real news and how they all play out in the creation of an alternative archive is what I was looking at in this fascinating work. And I think there's just one more example that I wanted to share, which again, very hard to talk about because this is actually a dance. And so what you see is a frozen moment of a dance from Farah Saleh's works, also of illegal education, CIE, which is a dance commentary on the conditions of studying under the first Intifada in the 87. And what Saleh does is she actually engages in a photographic archive, personal archive of photographs from the first Intifada, and creates an entire dance dialogue that is both an homage to what she calls gestures of resistance and a critical engagement with it, and a speculative engagement with the archive that draws attention and to the body, another point of connection with Shirley's work. So I think this gives a touch of the project, and I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gil. I'm going to add in Helga. Hold on just a second. Spotlight, and we'll get Shirley up here as well. Okay, take it away, Helga. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much to Kivo. Thanks so much to the Center for Media, Culture, and History. It's actually amazing to see so many people here. So it's great to see, you know, most of you are behind the screen. But anyways, thank you both, Gil and Shirley, for doing this and for doing this together. Shirley, congrats on the book. I know it's a huge achievement. Not to say that Gil's is not, but I know like the first one is just always great. So congratulations on that. I'm just going to sort of skip right into perhaps some, not so much my thoughts as much as my questions. And while I think some of the differences in both of your works are really interesting, I'm going to start actually with what I saw as a sort of interesting kind of overlap, right? So a kind of similarity. So first, I just wanted to kind of at least recognize, Shirley, that you are undertaking a kind of important task, which I think largely is still marginal, I think, in a lot of in a lot of studies about Palestine, Israel, which is you're really trying to kind of bring back together that whole discussion of what is it that actually ties Mizrahim and Palestinian experiences together, right? And I think you're quite explicit in saying that, look, we need to sort of be theorizing them or thinking about them together precisely because Zionism has tried to kind of always present and position them as far apart, right? So I just sort of, I want to kind of recognize that that's part of where your project is coming from, and how it's not that it's unique, it's obviously sort of building on other works, but it still tends to be a somewhat, at least in my knowledge, right, a somewhat kind of not quite the most popular way to go about these things, right? So on the one hand, I recognize that both of your works are very different, and we'll kind of come to that in a sec. But one thing that strikes me about both is a kind of commitment and an argument towards undoing the status quo, right? Whether it's the divisions that might exist between Mizrahi and Palestinians, or the status quo of how we may have approached something like history and archiving so far. And both of you seem to be, at least implicitly, sometimes explicitly, working towards a kind of different political, cultural outcome based on challenging these status quos. And so I feel like underlying vision, perhaps if I can call it that, of your work, perhaps there's even a kind of intentional politics to your work. I think you've both been kind of pretty straightforward about like, that there is so much of this that is a kind of political project, right? And I think that that aligns interestingly kind of hand in hand in both of your works. And what I mean by that is that you're both seeming to make this argument that we are in the present moment, and I think we can stretch this present moment if you want till from 2002, if not, you know, whatever. But that this present moment kind of, we're stuck in this, and there's this kind of political, maybe cultural sort of, well, not cultural. There's definitely a sort of political kind of impasse. And in your case, Gil, I think you're trying to point to the kind of echo chambers that we sometimes sort of fall into or that we're lost in, like, we already know what happened, we just refuse to hear it or accept it, right? And it's kind of time to move on from that particular story. And so even though you're both kind of approaching things in very different ways, you're kind of also both trying to tell the story of how does one relate to another. Gil, I feel like in some of your work, it comes through in the ways that particular artists have kind of drawn on archives that are not perhaps Palestinian in the kind of traditional sense, right? So kind of going into a kind of ethnomusicologist archive who's German Jewish, going into the Israeli archives, going into, I don't know, sort of more pop culture films, going into photographs. So kind of looking in how to tell one story in relation to the other, but this other is often sort of hidden in the archives, if you will. Whereas Shirley, I think your kind of objective is sort of much more straightforward in that it is about how do we kind of immerse each other in each other's stories, right? And how do we sort of bring those back together? So I feel like what kind of ties your work together is one, this kind of recognition that, okay, we're in this moment, politically at least, of some sort of impasse and something new needs to happen, some kind of new challenge. And you have both different challenges of how we might do that. I think the other thing that's interesting is that you're both kind of pointing to, I think Shirley calls it a mediated vulnerability, right? And I kind of think that perhaps there's something that echoes in both there, in that whether it's the practicing of our emotional relatability in the work of Shirley, or whether it's in the reactivization of different archives in the work of Gil, I think you're actually both speaking to the power of the mediated, right? Whether it's artistic or filmic or otherwise. And so, and I mean that both. And so I guess maybe my first question to you both is, can you speak to this idea of the power of the mediated? And I mean this both in terms of like an intellectual disciplinary kind of approach, right? So what is it about the particular fields that you're coming from that enable you to kind of say that, well, this is the place where a new politics can actually happen, right? So on the one hand, it's a kind of intellectual, disciplinary sort of question, perhaps even methodological question. On the other, it's also a kind of political question of why is it that it's sort of in the world of this mediated forms that possibility seems to be possible. So I guess I'm just asking, you know, why and how are these mediated forms of different kinds the place from which to kind of start a new form of politics? So that's my first question to you guys. I don't know who wants to take it on first.
I think Shirley does.
We read each other's minds in the books, so I don't know if I want to, but I can start, let's say, kind of like a collective exchange. Thank you, Helga, so much. This is extremely generous and just like the learning is is happening. Really, I can't thank you enough. I think that so my background is in the visual arts, actually, and visual studies, right? And like, you know, like making video art myself. And so like that was kind of the world where I came from, to studying documentaries. And I think like when I started kind of navigating through like a lot of like documentary theory, you know, the big kind of heavy question, and kind of like that sometimes became, I think, an impasse, was that question of representation versus the real and reality, and the very simulated kind of like question, right? Like documentaries have a claim to reality, but they're fictionalized, they're cinematized, and so there just like that kind of kept showing up. I felt like in documentary theory, like it's not actually reality, it's mediated. And right, like that's kind of like where we came from, right? Like post-structuralism, right? Like the 70s, this is representation, this is representation. And I was like, okay, but we need to consider power relations, right? Like where and when does a group of people, right, have the authority and power to decide this is a reality that mainstream is showing a lot and claiming that to be real, and this is a reality that we hardly see, right? Like, and this is a book about the early 2000s. This is the time that technologies have changed. This is the time that people are starting to use YouTube, right? Like 2005, and social media and all of these things. So everything is changing. So there's a lot of just underrepresented, not to say unrepresented, misrepresented, right? Like visuals, imagery that are going out there, right? And saying, no, this is our reality. Don't use these post-structuralist claims that documentary is not depicting real reality to gaslight us, right? Don't do that. I mean, not that it's always happening. It's not always happening, but there's a reactionary move, right, to question what you're showing. And so that's something that I just felt like was so powerful. There's so much cinematization in these documentaries, and there's so much, this is my story. This is my reality. And I want you to hear this, right? And same, I think for me, like also kind of moving from a lot of like learning a lot of like theories about trauma, right? Those heavy trauma in the documentaries, moving from talking about trauma to talking about pain, right? Because, right, like in trauma studies also, there's this like, the real is unspeakable. Thanks, psychoanalysts, like, you know, Lacan, and the real is unspeakable. No, we speak the real of reality of ourselves, and we show it all the time, right? We show it with our bodies, we perform it, we are it, right? Who gets to say, this is unspoken, right? This is unspeakable, right? What are the political contexts in which something is unspeakable, right? And I found that the term pain, or the framework of pain, was really helpful in trying to kind of theorize and make sense of telling a story that's in your body, that's lingering in your body, that maybe it's not intelligible, or right, maybe it's not a depiction of reality in the normative senses always, but it is showing a reality that exists and keeps existing. Was I answering?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of things to respond, but I'm going to kind of give some room first.
So if I understood the question, I'll try to was sort of about the mediation in terms of representation and artistic representation, I guess, in both cases. For me, it's a pretty straightforward answer in the sense that because I'm writing against the kind of authority of the archive, and archive as an institution, for me, the archive in general, but definitely in the context of Palestine, is the most it's the most highly suspicious entity to be challenged in any possible way. First, because of course there is an uneven distribution of archival material. There is also, just the very fact that that the Palestinian archives that exist, most of them have been confiscated. So all of them either disappear into the Israeli archive or incorporated into the Israeli archive. The end result of this game, I think, is that we kind of are. At best case scenario, archives are open, state archives, IDF archives, and people find more information, then they close, then more information. But the end result is a accumulation of knowledge already prescribed and already within a framework, and the framework also in which, ironic as it is, always ends up with, and thank you to the IDF for access to the archive. In every single film that includes Palestinian archives, there is at the end, thank you to the IDF. You can check it. I am not inventing this, right? So in some ways, what art provides in this particular context. I don't want to sound, a Dorian and it's like give a speech about, modernism and art, but in this particular context, I do think there is the art allows some escape. Again, the escape is not a nihilistic escape, as Helga's mentioned. There is an actual direct engagement with archival material, and I'm very glad, Helga, that you mentioned this. The idea of that you're right, that the beginning of how one tells one's story in all of this work is through the work of others and in relationship to it, right? Including the voice of a German Orientalist, including the Israeli film archive, etc. But it is a means, I think, to move away from a centralized authority of an archive and a creation of multiple archives. That's one. So there's a multiplicity. Second, there really is this, for example, in the case of Rowan and Bassal's work, the idea that, the present is here. We can go and pick up stones and flowers, etc., and create an archive, right? We don't have to enter state archive and find documents. So that's a second level. The third really is that I think that all of these works, the way I read them, because they call on us to engage in imagination, imagining something else, something that builds on a past, but that we don't really know where it ends. We don't know what this exact end solution is. It is asking us to practice imagination. I think it's also a reminder that this present that we're talking about, and that, remember, in the context of Palestine, the fixation on archive, which is in this case primarily actually a fixation on archaeology, is mostly done for one reason. If you think of the present of the entity we call now Israel-Palestine, it only has a present. It is 74 years old. It's yesterday. That doesn't have an archive. I'm sorry. Like, that doesn't have a past. It only has a present. And because of that, I think it is not just that it's more effective to look at art that is futuristic, it actually is counterproductive politically to give so much force to an archive of a past, because it expands the past into what I think Larissa Sansur shows is science fiction. It's, that as if this entity of 74 years old entity is somehow really lingering from biblical time to the present. So that's, I think, my answer. It's a temporal engagement. It's a call for imagination over dashing through and through historical facts. And it's a sort of a refusal to engage in the power of the fact. It's very connected in my analysis to the role of history and capital H and archaeology, because these are disciplines that are serious, right? And art and representation is not serious, right? So it's like there's the people who imagine, and then there's the serious people who dig things. So of course, it's kind of in that sense, it's I was asked in another context if the book is anti-historian, and I'm like, no, I mean, we can't, everything is historical, right? I mean, of course there's history here, but it is a critique of the role of history, capital H, and archaeology and psychoanalysis as sort of access to serious traces and therefore serious disciplines. And yeah, so.
Great, thanks. My first kind of response is a little playful, right? In that I think my dad would appreciate hearing that, oh, 74 is still the present, right? He's 78, 79. So it's like, oh, so you're still kind of young, right? So it's just, I think it's important to sort of put it in that context, right? I think, Gil, you know, to be perfectly honest, I think one thing that I really kind of appreciated about your work is what I could call, in a sense, this kind of brutal honesty about it, right? And, you know, it's a bit of like, okay, you know, I'm just going to rip the Band-Aid off of these arguments that are going on. And I'm just going to sort of tell you the way it is, right? Is that, look, we can keep digging and looking for more, but that's not necessarily going to change the kind of current or present narrative, right? And so part of it is, I think, the way that you set up the argument against the archive, against against history and historicization, I think is really, for me, I found it very kind of refreshing, but also you just do it in this very kind of brief and eloquent and powerful kind of way. So I recognize that there was a kind of political sort of challenge to history with a capital H, as well as archaeology and psychoanalysis and so on. There's also a very kind of disciplinary, intellectual, and methodological critique of those too, which I found kind of really powerful. So on the one hand, though, I feel like there's a kind of interesting, it's not so much a contradiction, but there's something that's kind of interesting in what both of you are doing, right? Is that you're both saying that, look, we need to build on the imagination, whether that imagination is how do we relate to each other or how do we overcome the present towards a yet to become future, right? On the one hand, I could say, yes, your work is about artistic ways of dealing with archives, and it's about film, right? On the other hand, both of you, whether through the archives and the art or the artists that you're looking at, or through the films, land on very specific, sometimes very material and embodied things, right? So for Gil, I mean, you take us through music, you take us through walls, through architecture, through streets and alleyways of Jaffa. You take us through archaeological materials and ruins and masks and copies of masks. You also take us through bodies, right? Which obviously sort of connects to Shirley's work in a very interesting way, because Shirley, while as much of your work is about film, it also really is very much about kind of, I don't know if I want to say sort of listening to one's body or listening to another's body, but kind of thinking about what are the lasting impacts or effects that are still felt within whether a body or a psyche, right? So whether it's the ringworm children that you gave the example of, or whether it's the destruction of particular houses, a lot of it is also kind of this very material embodied, or there's these very material and embodied sites in which both of your work seems to kind of land back on. And so one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is, so Shirley, I feel like I can read your book as pain and the pain of others as the kind of organizing principle that kind of ties a lot of the arguments together. And that that is a way to sort of practice this emotional relatability that you're saying. Gil, your last, I think is the last chapter, the one on dance, right? Was that the last chapter? Yeah. So the last chapter ends with dance, which I thought was really interesting. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it's because I was trying to sort of think of the connections between you two, but you kind of present dance as this kind of affective archive that will teach us how to, I think you say something like, how do we learn to move politically? And that's a very embodied kind of question too. And so I just wonder if you can kind of speak a little bit to, yeah, I guess kind of how you see that relationship between the material, whether it's the body or the ruins or the streets or the actual, the film itself, right? So how you kind of see the relationship between those, but also this kind of tension of, well, but these are the things that need to be excavated. These are the things that need to be told, right? So there is also still a kind of almost psychoanalytic, archaeological, and a different approach, right? But there is still this somehow this question of, well, how do we bring that back up, right? How do we sort of present it maybe in a different way? How do we listen to it in a different way? How do we play around with it or juxtapose it or bring it together? So I don't know if my question is clear, but I feel like there's this sort of interesting, tension, I guess, between what I'm going to call the material or the embodied, and then this more kind of imaginative, ephemeral, something that still needs to be excavated.
I can start very, try to be brief. First of all, I think it's a really great observation and a great comment, Helga. And it actually helps me. I haven't thought about it in those terms, and it's very helpful. It kind of is a new way for me to look about some of the tensions. And as you were speaking, I was thinking that in every single one of the works that I talk about, that tension actually exists in the work itself. And I think it's not something I've thought about before, but I think that the real reason for that is that when, if we want to be able to learn how to read the present as an archive, and as an archive that carries traces of the future, we can't actually really let go of archival activity, right? And actually, I am suggesting that all of these works that I engage with are sort of archivally obsessed, right? They cite and recite, and it's intertextual, and it's but there is a restlessness with the archive. So that maybe what the tension really amounts to is something between engagement with material facts and traces, but a restlessness that keeps them, nothing ends up functioning as the quote unquote last word or the fact, right? It's a kind of a circulation of the work of the archive that doesn't really end in a so much in a fact as, for example, really in the dance chapter. And I think that Saleh's work is, by the way, she has a whole series for anybody who is interested in dance of dances. All of them are really about, this way or another, about archives and the idea of gesture as an archive. And the brilliance of it is that gesture is precisely that thing that you actually can't archive, right? So every time you archive it, you're regesturing. So there is a tension of, on the one hand, traces, but traces that you can't really, to put in the most literal material way, you can't really put in a folder and on a shelf. So, but it's a really great way. I thank you, Helga, because I haven't thought about it in that way. And it's very productive, I think. I'll continue to think of it.
Yeah, the more we talk, the more I'm really feeling like, oh, these books are so connected, and obviously, like, Helga, your work on Palestinian cinema and media is here. Gil, Visual Occupations is here. Maybe I'll just take this moment as an opportunity to just answer by showing a few more images. So this is Ibtisam Marana's 2003 Paradise Lost, thinking about the materiality of memory, thinking about the materiality of the story, of the testimony, and of the body, and this beautiful moment, and of course relating also to the archive, where the filmmaker Ibtisam and Suad Ghanem, who is kind of lead participant in the documentary, and they take out from like a box in Suad's family house, a box of newspaper clips, old ones, just like from the Israeli news, kind of like calling her a terrorist and accusing her all sorts of accusations. And she's talking about her time in prison, and she's talking about her fingers, and we really see her fingers right here. So she's talking about being in prison and being emptied by her tears, her crying, and the kind of like really like abusive pressure, right, of the Israeli prison. And there's a demonstration, right, like in her body of just like touching the newspaper, taking in the memory of the past, and really the emphasis in my writing that the past lingers, right? That the past is archived. That just Gil, I think you just said that the past lives on in a way where every time there's an encounter with that memory or with that experience, it's a reliving of that pain. It's a continuous reliving, and also it's a reliving in front of the camera, and that's a huge part of how relatable I think it is. It's really walking us through the participants. I really care about these participants in the documentaries, right? Not just the filmmaker. They're walking us through how oppression became pain, right? How the political became them, became the fabric of their bodies and our bodies, right? And this is her right here. Suad Ghanem, a few more examples. This is Queen Khantarisha, Israela Shair Meoded, about this Yemenite Israeli poet, Bracha Seri, also about crying, right? Really, very embodied, crying and writing poetry as very interrelated, and then, right, the demonstration of that. I talk a lot about silencing, right? That they talk about silencing in that documentary, Queen Khantarisha, of Yemenite women and of their elegies, and she's showing it to us. So the showing, we can think about it as just, oh, okay, they demonstrate in a documentary, but no, also it's a reliving, also it's a taking us into the feeling in their bodies, right? And it's also just this happened, this became me, this is me. So I'm so with you on this is the present. This is the present. It did not go anywhere, right? And we need, right, to be able to extend and expand, right? Like a ways of accessing communication and language, right? And embodied, right, language to really hold all of these different ways of communicating and expressing our embodied states and our affective states. And I think, right, like we've all been through 2 years almost of global pandemic. We're all like talking and looking and like expressing ourselves differently, right? Like, so things are changing, right? So yeah, that's that's kind of just a last one. I had a terrible earache. I couldn't hear a thing. This is her writing. She's writing. And it's a very visceral kind of embodied process, and it's an embodied process in the performance. Yeah, okay, yeah.
I'd like to invite everybody to post some questions, whether in the chat or directly sending them to Jim or raising your hand. Oh, Zvi. Zvi's always super quick. Zvi, go
He
ahead.
also has the most amount of books around him.
Zvi, you're
You're
muted.
muted.
Oh, somebody has to unmute him.
It says
Yeah.
I've asked you to unmute. You should be good now. There you go.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the presentations and the talk. I'd like to make 2 quick comments and a question. Comment number 1, thank you, Shirley, for a really magnificent project, and congratulations on your book. I think that, you know, Arab, Jewish / Mizrahi history and Palestinian history have been said recently to be on collusion, in the sense that, like, it's supposed to be replacing each other. I think you opened the door for what we've been struggling for many, many years, which is actually to view these histories as complementary, rather than, you know, histories that are supposed to come and supplant the one is supposed to come to supplant them, each other. The Mizrahi one is come to supplant the Palestinian one. I am intrigued with Gil. I read the book. I am not the only historian who loves the book. Okay, so that's, first of all, right to put it there. But I really think you're right about, you know, the fact that we need to think about, you know, the present, not just, you know, not just in terms of, you know, the short temporality, but also the fact that, you know, somehow Palestinian history seems to be put in a place of ahistoricality. And that is something that produces the present. I mean, I can see a parallel with Mizrahi history as well, you know, in terms of where it stands. And this is not something that historians alone should deal with. In fact, I think that historicality is not a matter for historians sometimes, you know, for a much broader view. And I don't know if you can comment on that from that point of view. Okay, in other words, the present, the Palestinian everlasting present is a problem of Palestinian historicality, you know, particularly in the land itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand what you're saying, but I'm not 100% sure, so I don't want to take it to a wrong direction. Maybe say another word or two.
Okay, so let me rephrase that. Historicality could be also historicity, but recently, you know, when we talk about historicity, we mean something completely different. So I didn't want to talk about that. You talk about the present here as a 74 years. Okay, so that's a very, very small temporal framework, you know, so that renders the present. But I'm talking about a different present. I'm talking about a present that is always there because it is not historical on one hand, or the other hand, we don't want to render it as just as something as a matter of the past. Okay, right. So I'm talking about a present that, you know, it becomes a present because it is never historical, never becomes historical. Okay.
Right. No. Yeah. Yeah. No. It's a great comment. Thank you, Tzvi. And actually, I didn't think about that in that term again, and that's also making me sort of think anew. I think. You know, my engagement with that would be that, yes, it is true. The question, I suppose, would be what, you know, I mean, one way that one could address that is, and I think I mentioned that in the book, is the kind of attempts of creating the moment before the moment, or the history, potential histories, the histories that have not been documented as master history, etc. And I think those are all very important in the sense that they open up history. but there is a tension, I think, which is that it's not just that the 74 years is a short period, but that the fact of the facts that have created this spasm in this entity, that has created an entity that exists and doesn't exist, Palestine, that exists as a metaphor, a non-state, a state, a past, a future, all these things. I think on the one hand is, you could say in terms of historicity, it's a very short period. In fact, it's a period, not really, as I said, not worth considering as history, therefore also considering as something that is easily undone, because, I do insist, and I've had quite a few arguments, including to the level that certain parts of the book ended up being out of the book because of various arguments was the editor on it. But I do think that there is a difference, that it is not true to talk about Palestine as a settler colony, the same as New Zealand, the US, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think the fact that it's 74 years old makes a big difference. I think it's a living reality. For better or worse, I also think that it is therefore more changeable than the US. And I know this is not a favorable position because it suggests that that indigenous people elsewhere in the world, have less chances of decolonializing reality. I think there is, of course, a lot of room for decolonializing. I do believe that the action of decolonialization in Palestine can result in a reshaping of even state constitution. I highly doubt that that is possible. Maybe I'm just a pessimist, but 400 years to me seems significantly harder to reverse. But I think that moves away from your question, Antzi. What I did want to say about that is that this is on the one hand. On the other hand, because the colossal spasm that took place is so powerful, because whether we like it once again, because Zionism is science fiction, it is significantly more powerful than many other historical movements. And precisely because I think it taps into a very powerful imaginary, it is also, there's also a limit, I suggest, to the expansion of any kind of historical potentiality, missed opportunities, etc. But once again, of course, these are not negating. I mean, I wrote my first book is all about the Arab Jew we were and that we shall become. So I'm certainly not negating the importance of that. I do think that it is important to, and I try to emphasize that in a book, that becoming Palestine, it precisely operates on this the non-historical component of or entity that we call Palestine, right? Which means that it moves back and forth and between materiality and metaphorically, etc. I don't know if that answered, but I do appreciate the question very much.
I'd like to invite others to post or raise. Oh, go ahead, Roni.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Jill and Judith. It's so great to see you, and thank you for these fascinating works, and congratulations. I think I want to raise a quick and simple question that is related to the question that was raised before about your choice of the mediated form. I think it's very interesting to me that you, first of all, I definitely identify, Gil, with your resistance for making history. I am intrigued by your framing of Zionism as science fiction, but I'm really curious about both of your choices in cultural media, your focus on film, especially video art, documentary, these kind of art forms as a space for imagination as opposed to other art forms, and your understanding of this as, being a site that is politically fruitful, or allows for a type of imagination. And I wonder whether you place, other art forms, especially the literary form, especially literary fiction, as, a form of the past, for lack of better word, whether you place it alongside history, or whether that wouldn't be suitable for, for narrating this continuous present that we're talking about. So I guess I'm just curious. I'm not lamenting it, but I'm curious about your turning away from literary fiction and your focus on film and video art and documentaries.
I will just quickly say that I engage at least with 2 works of literature in the book. So I do not negate the literary. Actually, I actually make no distinctions, and I know that it can cause a problem for some, but I make no differences in terms of the medium. So I don't see one medium as more conducive than others. So that's just a quick one.
Yeah, me neither. Hi, Ronnie. Thank you for this question. And I want to say this is where I think the framing of visual culture is really important, right? Where we don't have hierarchies, or we want to, as much as we can, get rid of the hierarchies, right? Like the literature, the fine arts, and then way below, like people's posts on social media, right? Like the visual culture framing also says, right, like popular culture matters so much, right? It's hyper visualized and more, right? Like we're all taking selfies, right? And so the framing really is, I think, visual culture. And I said a few things about why I chose documentaries earlier, and I will say maybe a few more things. I'm really not a literature scholar at all. I came from the visual arts, from visual culture. I think that it's something that's highly accessible in different ways, right? That engages, visual culture engages our bodies, and audiovisual culture in different ways than literature does, right? It's like documentary, and especially these documentaries, the early 2000s, right? This documentary, right? Like you can watch it on your personal computer if you have one. You can access most of these documentaries either for free on YouTube or for very few dollars, right? So it's accessible, it's available, and it's a friend. Like you need a good cry, right? Like you need a good cry, and then you can watch it again, and you can rewind, and you can move forward, right? Like it's here for you, right? And I think that's really, really, really powerful. And I think that we need to think more and more about just visual culture at large, and what happens for us and with us in engaging in it, and and kind of enhance our ways of wanting to train better, train our eyes better, train our looking, right? Practice looking and critical looking. Yeah.
Yeah. Kareem. Can we unmute? Kareem? I don't know how that works.
I've asked him to unmute. You should be able, hold on.
Okay, I just got the request. Before then, I wasn't able to. Thank you. Thank you all for an excellent conversation. I have a question for both of you. Together or separately, there may be a bit of difference in your answers to this. I'm curious about the place of storytelling for both of you, because in a sense, Gil, I've had a chance to read your book. I haven't yet, Shirley, though I look forward to it very much. Gil, you talk about, mentioning Edward Said's article, Permission to Narrate, a permission to refuse narrative, towards the beginning of your book. And in a sense, narrative there seems to stand in for kind of existing narratives with fixed identities, fixed notions of the nation state and so on. But at the same time, you also put a lot of emphasis on narratives in the sense of like the Auda stories that are in the Zochrot book, the imagined testimonies. And surely, you know, in documentary, of course, storytelling has a very important function that you seem to be focusing on in your comments here in terms of where the pain came from, the political narrative behind that. But I also think that for both of you, there may be this movement away from, you know, evidence as a role, evidence as like the primary role of documentary or of films that are engaging with material conditions. I know this argument better in Gil's book in terms of, you know, we don't need more proof because Palestinians have long said what happened to them, and now the archives have, you know, also revealed that what Palestinians were saying for decades did happen. But I'm curious also for you, Shirley, focusing on documentary, maybe between a tension between evidence and narrative, or what the role of storytelling is that is distinct from archive or sort of fixed histories, if that makes sense as a question. Yeah.
Shirley, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Karim. I think I am really interested in evidence. I think it's just a question of like evidence for what, right? And in storytelling, the evidence is this is the experience of a people. This is an experience of past generations. This is an experience that I know about from family and from community. This is evidence. Very much so for my survival of this, for my resilience, for the resistance that is happening. And storytelling is a form and way of resisting, and very much so in the form of film performance, which I focus on, right? Like I'm here, I'm telling my story. I've put the pieces together, even though so many institutions and authorities have tried for me not to have this story for myself and for family and community. So I think I am really interested in evidence. And of course, Jenin has been, right, like under, right, like trials and kind of like really like the questioning of what's evidence in like people sharing about their experiences in the Jenin refugee camp after Defensive Shield in 2002, right? So the question of evidence really is very, very key there. And I go into like what constitutes evidence and really, again, what I mentioned earlier, kind of engage in trauma discourse or trauma studies where there really is that argument that like, well, sometimes you can't exactly say what happened to you because the trauma has been so hurting and so deep. And what I say is, well, you can, but the way you're going to say it is not in this like normatively intelligible, like ableist also language. So I hope that's an answer.
I'll be short, and hi, Karim, very nice to see you. I guess in my case, the focus that I had in this particular selection of works was really kind of drawing attention that there is actually maybe more of a resistance to not just evidence, but really to, on the part of the artists, in my reading of it, to take the position of speaking from the place of the wound. I think all of these works are very much emphasize a certain levity, a certain mischievousness, and an insistence on that. And I found that important. I mentioned in the book that I also do think it's a generational aspect, because I think, you know, there's just as much sort of continuity that people, especially creative people, as you know, artists, writers, etc., can take to limit the mode of expression to one of perpetually speaking from a certain position of victimhood or the term that has become very popular thanks to this wide circulation of Agamben's homo sacer term. So I don't want to go deep into it, but I think that if I would have to say something, I would say that there's a tendency in all of the arts that I've looked at to really speak very strongly against the idea that the truth is found in the inability of the subaltern to speak, and that the truth is found in the position of the homo sacer, and that the closer to homo sacer you can prove you are, the more truth you resonate. And that as I said at the very beginning, the right to have right is really insufficient. That's a bare minimum. The right to imagine, the right to have fun, the right to make jokes, the want to be mischievous, the right to create a cyber hack of a museum, that's the right to life. And I think that, in that sense, of course, it's not a negation of Said's early right to narrate, but it's a complication of the position, or sort of, a kind of criteria. How many times does a victim need to narrate their position and subjectivity in terms of victimhood, right? There comes a time where it's no longer even in terms of not just a general politics, but even in terms of, a self kind of position psychologically in the world. It's just, it comes a time where it becomes a burden, right? And that's right for any kind of it's sort of like, to take it to a completely different context. How many times, let's say, once a victim says, "Me too," how many times does she or he have to say "me too"? And are they allowed to say anything else? Or do they simply need to repeat that position, right? Again and again and again. So I think that's where I came to, and with this I'll end. Obviously, I'm not blind to the fact that my reading has shaped the way I curated these works together. But as far as I am aware of, I have come to the sort of bringing together of these works not with a preconcept, right? I sort of found these same concerns over and over again. And so I really do believe that they are informed by a certain generational sort of repositioning of the place of utterances and artistic production. But thank you.
Thanks, Kareem, and thanks both. If I can just sort of jump real quick on that notion, right? So yes, I think one can read your books as you are speaking from the position of, not from the position of, but you're telling us what different stories are being told, right? So from the perspective of storytelling, or from the perspective of reframing maybe how things are spoken. But you're also both, I think, you're both also dealing with the power of interpretation. And I don't, so it's almost like, okay, you guys, book 2.0 that you're going to write together perhaps starts from that, right? Which is, on the one hand, surely your book is about your interpretations of those films, right? So you are telling us as a kind of audience members that, okay, you now have the responsibility to kind of read these films, to look at these films, to immerse yourself in these films. You maybe give us some tools about how we might go about doing that, but ultimately it's almost like that responsibility lies with the viewer of those films, right? Which brings up a whole sort of set of questions. But that kind of parallels to me a little bit with what Gil is talking about, which is, on the one hand, how these different artists themselves kind of choose to reinterpret and kind of open the interpretation of those archives. But it's also the work that you're doing, right? The way you are choosing to sort of read those together. So I think what you're both, what is it also perhaps something that's similar in both of you is that, I guess I thought of it as, if I were to try to place solidarity, right, which is something that seems to also kind of be in common in your work, is that it seems to increasingly rest on the power of interpretation, right, on the power of allowing not just simply the story to be told, right? I mean, I think part of Gil's part of Gil's argument, I sort of take it as the story's been told many different ways, right? And we can retell it in many different ways. But what seems to be important here, and this is perhaps kind of what Shirley is also getting at, is how do we then listen to these stories? How do we interpret them? How do we understand them? So I think there's also that, there's a sort of opposite end. So I know there are still a couple of questions, but I also realize it's past 2 o'clock. So I want to thank you both. I think that usually Kivo kind of lets people hang out afterwards in the sort of virtual lobby. So I think anybody who's still here, you're more than welcome to do that. And I do have to leave, but perhaps I'll just throw out the one question that I think came through, if you want to address it, which is, who is the most desired audience for each of your books? And Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, yeah, and we can take that question up in the sort of post-game segment here, but thanks, before you have to go, I mean, I want to reiterate my sincere thanks to Helga for taking on the task of monitoring this event, reading the books, doing all the preparation.
I didn't write the books though, so I had an easy job.
Yeah,
By the way,
Helga,
Helga, Shirley and
you've
I are
been
not
there.
writing another book unless you're writing it with
Yeah,
us.
we're doing it
Yeah.
together. In person.
We'd love to take credit for that if it happens. But also thank you, Gil and Shirley, very, very much. And at this point, I'm going to end the recording, and then we'll go to our little post-game segment here. Thank you guys once again.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Helga. Thank you, James.